Is online education a scam? In this video, I'm going to be explaining why most online training programs don't get results, as well as sharing tips that you can use to create an industry-leading e-learning platform, training program, or course. So if we look at online education in general, most programs and courses are teaching people how to achieve a specific outcome. And the reason they get such a bad rap or are labeled as scams is because in order to achieve the outcome, there's two things you need. Number one, you need the right information or strategy, meaning what to do. But the second part, which most people don't talk about and most courses or programs don't even consider, is actually getting people to do it, meaning the actions that the people need to take to achieve success. And so if you're looking at the training program, there's two things you need to consider. Number one is the information, meaning if someone did this, what percent of people would get results? But then the other side of that is what percent of people are actually doing it. And so on average, if you were to look at a training program or course that was just content, meaning just training or just videos, about 5% of people that go through it will actually take the actions that the training program is teaching. And so even if the training program was giving you the best strategy that had 100% success rate of every single person that did it, only 5% of people on average are going to actually do it. Now, most training programs don't have 100% success rate in terms of actually taking the action. Most around 5 or 10%. And so if that is the case, if your training program has a 5% success rate of people actually doing it, and we know that roughly 5% of people actually do it, then for every 1,000 people that join your program, maybe 50 will take the action. And then from there, maybe 2 or 3 will actually get the result. And so you're looking at a success rate of below 0.2, 0.3%, which is not very good. And again, the reason this is so important is because even if that training program had 100% success rate of people that took the action, for every 1,000 people that sign up, only 50 are going to take the action. And so at best case, you're going to have a 5% success rate, best case, because not many people are actually going to be taking the steps. And so in order to build a great online education platform, yes, we need the right information so that when people do it, they get the result. But much more importantly is looking at what are we doing to actually change people's behaviors so that they do take the actions so that they can get the result. And so if we were breaking down an online education business, we could break it into these two halves, the content, which is the strategies that we're teaching, and looking at if someone was to do this, what percent of people would actually get the result? But then the second half is going to be, what are we doing to actually make sure people do it? And if you have an online training program already, a good exercise you can go through is imagine you were going to sell your business and you were going to write down every single piece of value that that business had in order to sell. How many things would be on that list? If it's just some content and some videos and maybe a Facebook community, that is not a very valuable business. The value comes from everything else, all the other systems, all the other infrastructure that you've built and added over time to increase the likelihood that the people that join your program actually take the action. And so if someone comes into your program and doesn't get the result, rather than ignoring it, find the reason they didn't get the result, because there's always a reason. And if you can find the reason, you can then find a solution. And once you build that solution, if you do that over and over every single day for 2 or 3 years, then you're going to have built something pretty great by the end of it. And so in this video, I'm going to be giving you the top tips that I've found to, number one, improve your content so that when people do it, they get a result. But number two, and most importantly, how to actually get people to start taking action, changing their behavior so that they consume the content and take the action so that they can get the result. And this has come from years and years of building programs and iterating and improving, as well as purchasing hundreds of online training programs, spending over $100,000 on online training programs. And so I've seen the worst of the worst and the best of the best. And in this video, I'm going to give you everything that I've learned throughout this journey so that you can create a great online education program. So step number one is, how do we maximize the percent of people that get results if they take the action? And within this, there's 3 areas that you can focus on. The first is going to be lowering the learning curve. So what I mean by that is if you're going to be telling someone to do something and it is quite complex or it requires some prerequisite knowledge, then naturally less people are going to be able to do it. And so at every step of your process, you want to look at what is actually required, what's the learning curve, and how can we reduce that as much as possible, simplifying the process, and ultimately removing the variables that are affected by user error. And so to give you an example of this, let's say you help business owners get clients, which is what we do. Well, you might teach them a strategy that requires a sales funnel with a sales video on it. And if you just said, go and build that, there's going to be a lot of potential user error because they might have trouble building the funnel, they might have trouble recording the video. And so you could reduce the complexity by giving them a template for the funnel as well as scripts for the video. And so that lowers the learning curve, but it still creates some potential issues. And so what we ended up doing was finding a strategy that doesn't involve a funnel at all. It doesn't involve a video, it doesn't involve any of those things. And so by doing that, anyone can come in and they don't need to worry about learning those new skills because the strategy we teach is much simpler. And so if you're looking at the strategy you teach and the steps that are required to make that strategy effective, the first step would be looking at how can I make these steps simpler? And then from there, ideally, is removing steps entirely so they are no longer even required. Next is expectations. And this comes from the program in general. If you're promising that your program will help someone make $1 billion in 2 weeks, then it's probably the wrong expectations. And so we want to manage expectations and be very clear as to what you're going to get from this. But it's not just for the program, it's at every single step. To give you another example, with our program, once someone launches their ads and start booking calls, we noticed that people would do a couple sales calls and they wouldn't make a sale and they'd get disheartened. And so what we did was we changed the expectation to say, just do 15 calls regardless of the outcome. And by doing that, it changes the expectation from I'm going to do some calls and make some sales to I'm just going to do some calls. And by doing that, on average, people do make sales within their first 15 calls, which is great, but that's not ever the expectation. And so they're much more motivated to do it. And then the final step when it comes to the success of the system is understanding clients' belief. And so there's two types of belief. There's belief around why it won't work, and there's belief around why it will work. And so when it comes to belief around why it won't work, understand that anytime you tell someone to do something new, they're likely going to have some sort of preconceived belief or idea as to why it won't work. For example, if you help people with weight loss and you give them a diet plan, they might have a belief that diet plans don't work. And so understanding those beliefs and then addressing them in your content to overcome them, for example, you could say something like, if you've tried diets in the past, they probably haven't worked because of this reason. And that's why this is different because of this reason. And so by doing that, you're addressing the belief and you're overcoming it so that they no longer believe why it won't work. The second half of this is the belief that it will work. If someone doesn't believe something will work, they will never do it. And so you could try to tell people why it will work or convince them why it will work. What we found works best is just showing it to them. So one of the things we focus on a lot is speed, because we know if we can get someone to launch their system within the first few days, they're going to start getting leads, they're going to start getting calls, and they're going to start making sales. And so we don't need to convince them that it's going to work. We can just prove it to them. And so looking at your program and thinking about what can I do to just prove that it works, rather than wasting time trying to convince them that it will work. So that is the content side of things, meaning if people do it, how many will get the result? Ideally, it should be close to 100%. But much more importantly is what percent of people are actually doing it. And so this is where we look at behavior of our clients. How do we increase the likelihood that when someone joins a program, they go through it and take the action? So with this, we can break it down into two areas. We have internal motivation and external motivation. So internal motivation is how motivated are you to achieve the result on your own? So it could be, I have this goal and I want to achieve this outcome. External motivation is I need to achieve this outcome because of some external factor. And so a bad example of this would be if your program was 400 videos long and you said, here are the videos, and at the end of it, you might achieve the outcome, good luck. To go through that, the client is going to require extremely high internal motivation, and there's almost no external motivation. So we want to look at both these areas and maximize them as much as we can. To really understand how this works, we need to look at neuroscience. And so the main driver for motivation is dopamine. And dopamine is essentially the anticipation of achieving a goal. Meaning if you're progressing towards a goal, the closer you get, the higher dopamine rises. And so dopamine is a drive, it's pulling you towards something. The other side of this is serotonin. And serotonin is released when we feel like we're on the right path, when we're doing the right things. It's essentially a pat on the back or reassurance that yes, you're moving in the right direction. And what's important to understand is that serotonin actually affects the effectiveness or the response or sensitivity to dopamine. Meaning if someone has very low serotonin, the way in which they respond to dopamine is going to be lower. They are not going to feel it as much as someone with high serotonin. And so if you're helping clients achieve something, on average, most people will have relatively low levels of serotonin. And so they're not going to be intrinsically motivated. So what we want to do is not just find ways to increase dopamine, but we also need to increase serotonin. By doing that, they're going to feel the dopamine more and therefore be more motivated. So how exactly do we do that? Well, we know dopamine increases in the anticipation of the goal. And so at the start of the program, if we can have small goals that are easier to achieve, then people are going to feel like they're closer to them and dopamine will be higher. And then from there, if we can help someone achieve a few of these small goals and then we show them how much they've actually accomplished, that is going to increase serotonin because they're going to look back and see what they've done and feel like, yes, I'm moving in the right direction, therefore increasing serotonin. And from there, it's going to increase their sensitivity to dopamine for the next goal. And so it creates this feedback loop. Every goal they achieve, they increase serotonin, and then for the next goal, they're more motivated because their responsiveness to dopamine is going to be higher. And this is actually the strategy that most video games use, or even a lot of movies. If you've ever watched the movie Lord of the Rings, as a very brief example of the plot, Frodo basically has to take the ring to Rivendell, and then he needs to take it to Mordor. Before he does that, he needs to fight this fire demon. They arrive at Mordor, but they realize they can't go through the front door, so they need to go around the back. He meets this gremlin person, encounters this big spider, and then finally they get to Mordor. That's obviously a very simplified version of the plot, but what's important to understand is that it didn't start out by Gandalf saying to Frodo, hey, I need you to do all these different things. It was simply, hey, I need you to take the ring to Rivendell. It was just the first step. And then once it was at Rivendell, they then need to take it to Mordor. But before they could go to Mordor, they need to fight this fire thing. And so it was like, here's the goal, And just before you get to the goal, there's this one thing you need to do. And then once you've done that thing, now we're moving towards the goal. But just before we get there, there's one more thing we need to do. To give you a real world example of this, let's say you help people find a relationship. Well, if you said, in order to find a relationship, there's 50 steps you need to go through, they're probably not going to be motivated to do it. But if you said, just before we get this relationship, there's one thing we need to do. We need to learn these foundations. Then they'll be like, okay, if I learn this, then I get the relationship. So one step and then goal. And then once they've learned the foundations, you could say, awesome, now you've learned the foundations. We can now look at how to get a relationship. But just before we do that, there's one thing we need to do. Maybe it's buy the right clothes before you go out. And so the user is thinking, okay, I'm one step away from my goal. I've got this one thing I need to do first, and then I achieve the goal. And then once I've got the new clothes, you could say, awesome, now you've done that. Just before we get this relationship, one more thing, we need to set up your profiles online. And so by doing this, the goal is always one step away, and there's always just one small thing in front of the goal. And that's going to increase motivation. The other benefit of this is that what's behind is always more than what's ahead. And so users can always look back and see, I've done all these things, and there's just one more thing I need to do before the goal. And so by doing this, it does two things. It increases consistency bias because the user can see, okay, I've done all these things, I'm going to keep going, and that's going to maintain my consistency. And the second thing it does is it enhances sunk cost bias, which basically means someone can look back and say, I've already gone this far, I might as well go one step more. And so these things combined are going to increase the user's intrinsic motivation. It's going to increase serotonin, which will therefore increase their receptiveness to dopamine, which is going to make them more motivated to continue the program and continue taking the right actions. On top of that, we can also use what's called curiosity bias. And so humans are naturally very curious, and that in itself can be very motivating. And so rather than showing your clients, hey, here's all the content, here's everything you need to do, if you withhold some of the content or the information for after they've done a certain thing, that curiosity is going to drive them to do it. And so an example of this in our program, we have additional upgrade packs where we give advanced strategies and training, but we don't give that to our clients right away. We give it to them after they've completed certain milestones. So the first one is once you've completed 15 calls, you unlock your first upgrade pack. And so the curiosity of wanting to know what is inside that upgrade pack is going to drive them through doing those 15 calls. And so we're using curiosity to increase internal motivation. And the final part of internal motivation is aligning incentives. So there are certain things that you likely know your clients need to do to get a result. And there are certain things that your client wants to do that often aren't the things required to get the result. And so if we can align these things so that the things the client wants to do are the same things that get them the results, they're going to be much more likely to do them. So for us, we know that two things that will increase the probability a client gets results is number one, if they track their data every day, and number two, if they do sales calls. So what we do is we set a requirement so that if someone wants to receive a custom action plan, the prerequisite of that is that they track 7 days of data. And so they want the custom action plan, again, curiosity. And so to do that, they do the right actions of tracking their data. Once they've tracked for 7 days, they can request a review and receive a custom action plan. We also offer upgrade packs and additional training and strategies once they've completed 15 calls. So we know we want them to do calls, so they're motivated to do the calls because once they do the call, they get the upgrade pack. And so again, curiosity as well as aligning incentives so that they're taking the right actions to get results. In terms of external motivation, there are a few things you can do here. One thing we've found works very well is setting calls for each milestone. And so on a specific call with the client, we will book in the next call for, let's say, 4 days in the future. And within those 4 days, the client has things they need to do. And so not only are they internally motivated to do the things because that's how they get the result, but they also know in 4 days they're going to have a call where they're expected to have these things done. And so now there's external motivation to complete those things. Another thing we do is make our clients launch their system as quickly as possible. So in the past, we used to teach how to do sales and then how to do lead nurture and then how to do lead generation before they actually launch their ads. And in order to go through that, it required a lot of internal motivation to see that through. Now what we do is we get them to launch the ads and then they start generating leads. And so now they're motivated externally to learn how to do lead nurture because they have leads. They need to know how to nurture those leads because they're there. And then from there, they're booking calls. And so now they have a call and now they're externally motivated to learn sales because they have a call. They need to learn sales. And so these are external drivers or motivation to push them forward so that they're taking the actions, and that is layered on top of the internal motivation. Another form of external motivation is accountability. So as another example, if our clients don't track their metrics for 4 days in a row, we'll reach out to them and remind them. And so we're keeping them accountable. Also, if they haven't booked certain calls within a certain time frame, we'll do the same thing. And so we're adding this layer of accountability to increase the external motivation to complete the actions. One other way you can increase external motivation is with the pricing structure of your program. So as an example, if your program was $10,000, if someone pays that upfront on day one, then it's kind of out of mind, out of sight. They're not really thinking about it. On the other hand, hypothetically, if you had a 10-week program and you split those payments up into $1,000 a week over 10 weeks, then every week they're seeing that payment come through. And so it's another layer of motivation pushing them forward because they can see consistently that they're paying for it, and therefore it's going to increase the likelihood that they use it. And so that is how we can increase both external and internal motivation to get users to take the right actions. Now, these are obviously some examples of what we've done. This has taken a while to learn these things and implement these things and test different strategies. For you to start learning and implementing these things, one suggestion I would make is look at the program as a whole, break down the different steps that users need to complete, and then use data to determine what percent of people are getting to each step and how can we increase the percent of people that get to this step. And then from there, how long is it taking each user to get to each step? So let's say step 1, 90% of people get to, and it takes them on average 7 days. What could we do to increase that to 99% of people get to step 1? And they're doing it not in 7 days, but in 5 days. If you go through this at every single step over and over time, you'll start to get more and more people going through it in shorter and shorter periods of time. And that's going to maximize the outcome of the overall program. So that's it for this video. Hopefully this has been useful. In summary, there are 2 parts of a program, the information and the action. And yes, we want information that if people do it, they get results. But the reason most people don't get results is because most people won't do it regardless of how good the information is. And so we want to maximize the likelihood that someone gets results if they take the action. And then from there, maximizing the percent of people that actually take the action. And we want to get both of these metrics as close to 100% as possible. And that is how we create a great online education program. If you enjoyed this, be sure to subscribe and stay tuned for more videos like this soon.